Thanks everybody for joining us. Before we get started with tonight's discussion, let me just remind or announce to people who don't know yet that we will be launching a daily Facebook Live show this Friday. Uh, Daily means we will be on every weekday, not on Saturdays and Sundays, at 6 p.m. UK time. It'll run for about 20 minutes. It'll be a rapid fire discussion, in some cases interview of a topic of interest, hopefully, to our viewers and listeners. The first show, we will be discussing the same topic that we are discussing today. And our speakers for that are Nikos and Gloria Alvarez. Well, they will be co-hosting the first show. And then the second show from Monday, we will announce that, and we'll have a full week of shows next week. So tonight's topic is keeping racism alive, how race baiters cash in on tragedy. We'll obviously be discussing the response to the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, the response by some of the protesters, by some of the other protesters, by some of the organizations organizing the protests and the riots, and by some of the companies who chose to take a corporate stand, and I would say in some cases showed their true colors, if I may. But anyway, Andy's disappointed with that. But Andy, you are our first speaker, so I'm gonna make sure I don't make any more of these faux pas. And the floor is yours.
No, that was pretty funny, Razi. Actually, good play on words. But anyhow, I take a very I'm a philosopher. I take a very broad, wide philosophical approach to this. First thing I want to say, I think should be obvious to anybody who cares about human life, any human beings, is the killing of George Floyd was just horrendous. I mean, I couldn't even watch. And the cops should know better than to have his weight on the dude's neck for like 9 minutes. So I mean that was just horrendous, and there's justifiably a lot of outrage about this. Also, should be just as obvious. Anybody cares about human life. The riots are horrendous. Burning down people's property, including many black businessmen, store owners. People get killed in riots. The riots don't help anybody. Don't help George Floyd. Don't help Black Americans. Don't help anybody. So those are also horrendous and need to be condemned by, I think, anybody who cares about human life. But the thing I want to talk about, is this claim that the United States is a racist nation. I'm gonna write an essay on this. That there's a pandemic anti-Black racism in the United States, and I think we need to define, first of all, what racism is. It's the idea that your moral character and or intellectual abilities are defined by whatever biological group you're born into, by your race or your tribe or your nationality. And I want to use racism in the broadest sense, of ethnic bigotry, especially violent ethnic bigotry, where they hate somebody because they're a member of a different tribe, different nation, different race, different religious group, and so on. And so that the United States is the claim that the leftists make is a distinctively, egregiously racist country, and like worse than anybody else. So I mean, I think the history here, a little bit of history certainly shows, the blatant anti-Black racism in the country. There's no doubt. If you Booker T. Washington, the great American educator, Black American educator, Tuskegee Institute, his staff kept a history of lynchings in the Jim Crow South, turn of the 20th century. The lynchings of Black Americans, generally men, sometimes women, without any trial, so we don't know whether these people were guilty or innocent of any crime. They were covered by newspapers. People would come like it was, white Southerners would come like it was to a picnic, and they'd watch some poor guy get lynched. And Booker T. Washington's staff at Tuskegee had a whole room filled with newspaper and magazine clippings about these lynchings. There were like, I think, more than 3,600 of them, in which the legal authorities never took action to perpetrate the murders, and in some cases the legal authorities were part of the Ku Klux Klan, and these racist murders. So that's what the lynchings of thousands of Black Americans we don't know, can't possibly know if they were guilty of any crime because they were never allowed to go to trial. The Tulsa race riots circa 1920, where Tulsa had this, in Oklahoma, had this booming, bustling Black community, the Greenwood section, where it was home to Black businesses, lawyers, doctors, teachers. It was a white racist mob, burned it to the ground, 1920, 1922, killed, I don't know how many, educated, prosperous Black Americans. The Wilmington, North Carolina race riot, 1898, the same. Burned down the Black newspaper, killed a lot of educated, successful Blacks. So the race riots in the United States prior to the 1960s were all white race riots, killing innocent Blacks. There's a whole history of this stuff. I don't have time to go into it. But that the United States was racist in that way, egregiously so, is absolutely right. Certainly especially in the Jim Crow South, but also in the North. Some of these race riots were in the North also. But you can also see at the same time, we're going to be objective. We're going to look at the facts here. The truth wasn't the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. We want to see the whole truth. The United States made a lot of progress since the 1950s and 1960s. With the rise of the civil rights movement. And one obvious example of progress in ameliorating or minimizing the anti-Black racism in white America was the Obama, president, the Obama, the hoopla around. You guys are old enough to remember the 2008 presidential election. I've never seen so much enthusiasm and excitement over any candidate in my entire life. And that included a lot of white voters. I don't remember the exact numbers, it'd be easy to look up, but there were tens of millions of white voters who voted for Obama. And then in 2012, he's reelected after let me put this generously, a mediocre first term in office, where the economy was still stagnant, where after promising the most transparent administration in history, he conducted any number of dirty backroom deals to get, with various U.S. senators to get the Obamacare bill through Congress. And then, of course, Benghazi, a few months before the election, where he didn't send in U.S. military assets and permitted Libyan jihadists to murder the U.S. ambassador. All of this, and he's still reelected. Tens of millions of white voters. So that's one data point. But I think more important than that is the rise, in the United States of an educated, affluent Black middle class in this country. We're talking millions and millions, of educated, successful Black Americans. And of course, one last data point on this. Thomas Sowell pointed this out, like circa 1980, in his excellent book, Ethnic America, that going back to the early 20th century, 100 years ago, Black Caribbean immigrants to the United States overwhelmingly tend to do very well, especially the children of Black Caribbean immigrants tend to have educational levels and living standards identical to, if not higher than, white Americans. And that goes back to 100 years ago when the Jim Crow laws were still in effect in the U.S. South. So we get these data points, raise some questions. Well, if white America is this egregiously, inveterately, pandemically racist group of people, how do all these millions of Black Americans achieve the educational and career success that they have? You wouldn't think it would be possible if America was this racist nation that the Marxist left points out. If America was racist in the way that Nazis, were racist, they'd be killing Blacks by the millions. So it raises these data points raise serious questions to the leftist claim about how racist America is. But I want to go wider here, because we learned from Ayn Rand, the objectivist epistemology: integrate, see the big picture, go as wide as you can, as you possibly can, to understand a phenomenon. I want to understand racism, not just in America, but around the world. So as you say, America, United States is a racist country. One question is very rational we need to ask is, well, relative to whom? You know, where's it better? Or, or where's it less bad? So I point out a bunch of examples. People seem to have short memories. The Rwandan genocide, you remember that? 1994, a minimum of 800,000, possibly 900,000 Tutsi, members of the Tutsi tribe, murdered by members of the Hutu tribe, very often with machetes, hacking people to pieces with machetes, sheer, unadulterated tribal hatreds and warfare. Little remembered today, but that needs to be remembered, is the Armenian genocide of 1915 during World War One. And Nikos, I know most Americans don't know. I know how many Greeks, the Turks wiped out at the same time, tens of thousands. But a minimum of 1 million innocent Armenian civilians butchered in the Ottoman Empire, in 1915 by the Turkish regime. The Holocaust, obviously, and American Jews have done a very good job of keeping that memory alive, with their motto of never again. But 5.1 million Jews murdered by the Nazis. Ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, in the 1990s, the endless struggle between the Orthodox Christians, the Muslims. You could go on and on with these kinds of examples. Nobody seems to know today that the Islamic slave trade out of Africa went on for centuries before the European version, continued throughout the European version, continued after the Europeans abolished slavery, and was curtailed to the extent that it was only by British, that is European intervention. The Islamic slave trade was even worse than the transatlantic slave trade, if that's possible. And you could read Ronald Siegel's book on this. You could go on and on with the examples. The Muslim conquest of India 1,000 years ago. No less a historian than Will Durant calls it the bloodiest story in history. Some Indian historians claim 80 million Hindus were killed by Islamic conquerors over the centuries following the Islamic conquest, roughly 1000 AD. And sectarian violence continues endlessly on the Indian subcontinent to this day. Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs. The endless religious violence in India is just appalling. I could go on with the examples, but I have limited time, and it's all appalling and horrifying anyway. And I think you get all these examples and many more that could be adduced, and the conclusion is it's a racist world. It's a racist world, including the United States. The United States is probably less bad than most other places. But racism has tortured in various forms, in endless iterations. It's tortured humanity since day one. And we're not even discussing the communists yet. We're not going to, right? Because the communists aren't fighting race war. That's the Nazis. That's the National Socialists. The communists fight class war. So the communists don't murder you because you're a member of some ethnic group. They murder you because you're a member of the bourgeoisie. That's much better. But we're not even don't have to discuss that because we're just limiting ourselves to racism. I want to go back one more example. This to me was amazing. Anybody here familiar with Yuval Harari's book 'Sapiens"? Harari is an Israeli historian, not an anthropologist, but he did all this research in anthropology, 5, 6, 7 years ago, published this fascinating book, 'Sapiens." At least I thought the first chapter was fascinating. Truthfully, I thought the rest of the book was boring. But the first chapter just popped my eyeballs because he points out, based on state-of-the-art anthropological research, sapiens, us, we weren't the only species of human beings in history. When I was a kid, they referred to the Neanderthals as kind of the missing link, like just some evolutionary development between apes and us. But we know today that's not true. Neanderthals was fully human as we are. They're Homo too, Homo, meaning Homo Neanderthal, Homo sapiens. And they were the dominant human group in the Middle East and in Europe 50,000 years ago. But what happened to them? And by the way, that shouldn't be a surprise that there were different species of the broad family man. I mean, look at cats as an example. Lions and tigers and, well, not bears, but lions and tigers and jaguars. Oh my, they're all cats, and as such they can reproduce. If you ever seen the liger, the offspring of a male lion and a female tiger, they're all cats. They're just different species of cats. Well, Neanderthals and sapiens and others, according to Harari's book, different species of Homo, of man. Well, what happened to the Neanderthals? Best guess, well, you can imagine, given the endless racial violence of human history, just among sapiens, best guess is that the Neanderthals were wiped out by the sapiens in the first, and certainly not the last, and maybe the most brutal example of ethnic cleansing in our history. An endless species war. So, I mean, it's a racist world. It always has been. And so, I think the United States is one of, maybe with Great Britain as well, is either the best hope to end racism, or one of the few best hopes to end racism, to overcome it, to be a beacon, an individualist, anti-racist beacon, a shining city on the hill, if I can quote the Puritans. First of all, the country's already made progress in America. We've already made progress on the racial hatred issue. The civil rights movement has been successful to a significant degree. There's further to go. But the key point, of course, is what's enabled the United States to make progress in this is the heritage of individualism and individual rights. And of course, the essence of individualism is a human being is an individual, is a unique and unrepeatable individual to be judged based on the choices that they make. A human being is not, a human being first, foremost, and always as an individual is not first, foremost, and always a member of some tribe, and not to be judged as a member of some tribe, something that you're biologically born into and not susceptible to volitional control on your part. People have to be judged by the choices they make as individual human beings. The individualism in America's heritage, I think, is one, what made possible the progress of the civil rights movement, and two, is what gives hope for the future. So I would say this final point: it's a racist world, including America, and America is the least bad.
Andy, I want to ask you about a point you mentioned there. So you said the hoopla around, you mentioned the hoopla around Obama in 2008. I am old enough to remember that. And Obama, one of the things that he did, not a lot, but occasionally, and I think the overall sentiment was there during his campaign, was to remind people of his skin color. Keep it out there that he will be the first ever Black president, that all former presidents were white. It was sort of there, and I think it played to some extent on this so-called white guilt, that white Americans should feel guilty for racist policies of the past in the U.S. Now, Obama won in 2008. He was president for 8 years, and much of the racial tensions, I think, may have gotten even worse under Obama. I mean, Black Lives Matter happened under Obama, and we see what we see now. And I wonder how much of what we see now from the media after the killing of George Floyd is, and from corporations, we'll talk about them later, some companies that have decided to make this an issue, and in ways which I find questionable. How much of that do you think comes from white people who feel guilty for things that other white people did?
Well, I think, and Obama is a good example. I mean, I was most definitely not part of the hoopla surrounding Obama. And people would say, "What, you don't like him because he's Black?" And I said, no, I don't like him because he's red, you know. And now he's not literally a communist. I mean, he's not Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev or somebody, Mao or somebody like that. Not literally a communist, but he's a leftist. He's a semi-socialist. The influence here, the philosophical influence is Marx. So that kind of uh, the kind of racism that we're talking about here comes from the political left, and in this case specifically the Marxist left, because I want to point out here that the Nazis and the neo-Nazis and the alt-right, they're leftists, they're socialists. If right wing has any meaning, it means individualism and capitalism, and then left wing means collectivism and socialism. So it comes from the Marxist left to distinguish it from the National Socialist left. And the idea, the Marxism, of course, its fundamental principle is that history is driven forward by inveterate class warfare, and that the rich get rich by exploiting the poor, so that the humanity is divided into groups. Again, it's the group that dominate, not the individual, but not racial groups, economic class groups. And there's the oppressor and the oppressed. And the oppressor, the rich have always been the oppressor, and the poor have been the oppressed. Now, today, the Marxist left is incorporating race war elements. They're incorporating National Socialist elements into their class war ideology. It's certainly in the United States, and I think in Great Britain too, right, and maybe other places around the world. It's the rich white oppressor, who's you're victimizing the poor non-white and the poor black oppressed. So they've incorporated race war elements into their class war ideology. And it's this. And so what you're talking about here just doesn't matter if these Marxists are white, if they're black, if they're Asian, if they're Latino, they're Marxists, and this is their philosophic frame of reference. And some of them are brutally violent. Antifa, is an example. And one of the things that I'm worried about, we saw in a microcosm in Charlottesville, Virginia, a couple of years ago, is these violent racist groups, the Marxist group like Antifa and Black Lives Matter, and then the National Socialist groups like the Klan, and the Nazi Party. And there's this race war in the streets. It's exactly what Leonard Peikoff discusses in The Ominous Parallels, which was published in 1983, by the way. Replicating in America in the 21st century the communist Nazi street battles of the Weimar Republic circa 1930. And so but what you're talking about, Razi, is it all comes from a Marxist philosophy, and yeah, it's exacerbating racial tensions because the Marxists now are promoting race war as well as class war. It's the rich white oppressor against the poor black oppressed.
Thanks, Andy. Nikos.
Okay, so I have two issues I want to bring about. First, I think it's very important we always challenge, and we need to challenge this narrative that the United States is a structurally racist or institutionally racist society, because it's an insult to logic. It's an insult to reality. And let me explain what I mean. In the United States, you have almost every big business being in agreement with the narrative of Black Lives Matter. Now, I'm not going to discuss whether this narrative is good or bad. That's not the discussion. The discussion is that it's almost impossible for you to be a big business and yesterday, for example, not to post the black square in your social media. The narrative of Black Lives Matter is completely dominant in all universities and in all aspects of education. Once I had the misfortune to have to apply for a university in the United States, and I had to write a separate statement on how my research would bring about social justice and diversity. And I had to write a whole page. Of course, I declined to do this. I didn't even apply, and I don't think I was missed, but anyway. So we have big business, the universities, the biggest part of the political spectrum. Again, they would all say, yes, we agree with Black Lives Matter. We have almost the whole of the media. Now, they're either 100% friendly, or they're critical, but not in a way that seriously challenges the narrative, with some exceptions. that are not considered by any means like mainstream. So my question is this: how can you have in a society where the education, the capitalist class, oh, also I forgot, the celebrities and the entertainment class, so all basic pillars of society, which the Marxists would say create hegemony and create dominant ideology, all those pillars are perfectly in accordance with the Black Lives Matter narrative. Again, irrespective of whether it's a good or a bad narrative, but they're in accordance with that. Now, how is it possible that this society is structurally racist? This is an insult to what we see with our eyes. So that's my first comment. My second comment is racial thinking is alive in the right, but the difference is it's alive in the right in some dark corners. Whereas in the left, it's alive in the academia. And I'm talking about this idea of critical race studies. Google or go to your library and find critical race studies. And you know what you're going to find? You're going to find a lot of things about how we need to talk a bit more about whiteness. Now, this is racial thinking par excellence, right? Let's talk about whiteness. What does this even mean? And what does the alt-right do? The alt-right says, oh yes, let's talk about whiteness, but it's not you people. We should talk about whiteness. So unfortunately, racial thinking today is more prominent and more alive in the progressive circles. And this is because the only way they can view the world is this tribalist mindset. They've completely given up on the universalist vision, on this humanist enlightenment vision that says we all share something together. We share this core of humanity. The only way they can see the world is with tribes, and these tribes being in conflict of power. So there is no surprise when we see the things we see. It's I don't want to sound deterministic, it's inevitable. Spend 5 hours in a university and you will understand why these kids and these people are out there rioting. Of course, the indignation about police violence is legitimate. The society might not be institutionally racist, but there's no question that in the recent past and probably in the present, there are racist elements in the police. There's a very good chance that this is the case at least. And there is indignation about how the police is treating, I would say, not only black people, but other peaceful people, for example, with the victimless crimes. So we should be fighting peacefully for these things, but let's make it clear, racial thinking is at the core of the dominant ideology today, but it's not the racism as it used to be, it's the racism as an expression of tribalism.
Nikos, unfortunately, I have to agree with you. And and I would add, based on some of the history we briefly discussed, it always has been. It is. We haven't even, as I'm talking about human beings, we haven't even come close as the human race to expunging this. Haven't even made a start, or maybe barely made a start with individualist philosophy that developed during the 17th and 18th centuries, but barely made a start to expunging it. It simply rears its head in endless different iterations. One just as hideous as the other. So as long as racial thinking, and that is, and you're right, the idea that race matters, as opposed to the idea that race does not matter, that humanity matters, but the idea that race matters, and this is part of the postmodernist view, in Okurant version of racism, that whatever race you're born into shapes your thinking. Whites will see the world in a certain way that blacks will see it in a different way. Now, if that were true, males would see the world in a different way than females, and there's a whole different worldview, a whole different Weltanschauung, a whole different mindset. If that were true, then men and women wouldn't be able to sit down and have heart-to-heart and mind-to-mind conversations that actually come to a meeting of the minds, which in reality happens every day. On the postmodernist view, it would be impossible. And similarly for whites or non-whites, Americans, or British, third world, immigrants from the third world and so on, it would be impossible. We have just different ways of conceptualizing the world, and there's there's no, according to the postmodernists, there's no dictionary of translation. So yeah, that is just pervasive in the universities, certainly in the United States, Nikos. You're absolutely right. The postmodernists are just pervasive. You pointed out nicely that, you know, the so-called alt-right, the Richard Spencers and the Jared Taylors, these guys are very well educated. They have master's degrees. They went to University of Virginia, Duke, University of Chicago. They went to good schools. They have master's degrees in philosophy and, you know, humanities and things like that. They were educated by these old school white racists, anti-non-white racists, were educated by the same postmodernist professors who educated the Black Lives Matter, you know, and the Marxist left. And the thing they share in common is the idea of race matters, and racial origins determine our worldview and our thinking. It's a determinist philosophy, completely abrogates free will, and the individual means nothing. You're just a member of the tribe. You know, you're not an individual. You can't think for yourself. And so, yeah, the antidote for this, as always, is a radical individualism. Human beings are not primarily members of a tribe. That's an enormously secondary and trivial consideration. Human beings are individual human beings, and they have a mind, and they could observe reality. They could think. They could judge. They could judge for themselves. And the examples of this are all around. You know, on the racist view that's so current and, you know, and intellectually fashionable today, if you're non-white, then you can't possibly be a supporter of capitalism. That's a system that exploits, you know, the noise. How do you explain Thomas Sowell? How do you explain Walter Williams? How do you explain Larry Elder? How do you explain all these conservative or libertarian or the objectivists? Aaron Briley, you know, this big Iron Man guy, black philosopher, wrote a brilliant essay on Black Lives Matter that was published at Capitalism Magazine.com. How do you explain, you know, these non-white, you know, thinkers who are individualists and capitalists? And then, you know, how would you, you know, if whiteness makes us inveterately exploiters and victimizers of the oppressed, how do all of these whites, including Marx and Engels, by the way, including Marx, Engels, you know, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Mao's not white, but, you know, all of these white guys then claim to support the oppressed, and they're fighting capitalism, they're fighting the oppressive system. Clearly the determinist philosophy that's inherent in racism, the idea that your racial origin shapes and mandates your thinking. I mean, it's obviously false. It's empirically false. And
Can I add something to this, please, Andy? Something very important is that more than caring about a specific group, an ethnic minority or whatever, these people have a political agenda. How do we know this? See how they treat black conservatives. See how they treated Condoleezza Rice, whom I don't really like, by the way, or Colin Powell, or what's his name, Justice Clarence Thomas. You will find in critical race theory, you will find people openly claiming that these people are not really black. And where do we see the same thing? We see the same thing with feminists saying, for example, Margaret Thatcher is not really a woman. So what does this mean?
Yeah, can I just add something to that before we go to Andy? Because yeah, we spoke about critical race theory in the past, and there was I brought up this quote, which is by the way the first thing you see on the Wikipedia page for critical race theory on the definition of it. This is from UCLA School of Public Affairs, and it says, critical race theory recognizes that racism is ingrained in the fabric and system of the American society. Now that's the nicer part. And then the next sentence says, the individual racist need not exist to note that institutional racism is pervasive in the dominant culture. So it doesn't...
Sorry. I have to say something on that. That's why I'm saying to people, it's very important to read the history of Stalinism. It's like full of this kind of stuff. Sorry, Razi, I interrupted you, but let me finish this, although I was the one who interrupted. See what was the procedure in the Moscow trials. You might not have done a counter-revolutionary activity, but the mere fact that you come from a bourgeois background considers you guilty. And if you don't see your guilt, this is a proof of your guilt. So it's exactly the same thing. If you don't see you're racist, this is a proof of your racism. This is exactly the Moscow trials playbook.
Yeah,
it's
but this,
not something similar. It's exactly the same playbook.
this says that the individual racist need not exist. I mean, it's not only do you not need to see it, it doesn't actually have to be there to be true. So first of all, how does that work? And second, how do you, if something like that is so prevalent that it's uncontested basically in academia, you know?
I got to say something, guys.
Yeah.
You know, what both you said. This is a basic guess. Basically, the philosophical influence is basically Marxism, German philosophy behind it, Kant and Hegel. And I want to say, modernist philosophy that proceeds from the German philosophers Kant, Hegel, and Marx is a secular delusion. It's as delusional as religion. It creates a secular world at odds with observational reality. It's got nothing to do with observational reality any more than religion does. Except it's not claiming that there's a supernatural dimension. But like the logic there. How can there be institutionalized racism if there need not be any individual racists? Well, I mean, clearly that's logically impossible. And it goes back something Nikos said before about institutionalized racism. And the Marxist left, it's not just morally and politically where they're so profoundly mistaken, epistemologically. I mean, they're so out of touch with reality. Institutionalized racism existed in the United States during the Jim Crow era in the South, and blacks weren't even allowed to vote. Never mind hold office or, get an education. Right? And we have an example of it right there. That's what it looks like. But what about today? That doesn't look anything like that today. You couldn't possibly explain the millions and millions of Black Americans who have an education and they're working as teachers or lawyers or doctors or business people or justice on the Supreme Court or president of the United States. You can't explain observational reality on this on this philosophy. We're attempting to, these guys, the Marxists left, they constructed a delusional world. They're attempting to impose their delusions on the rest of us. This is much more than moral and philosophical, moral and political struggle between us and them, between the supporters of capitalism and the supporters of socialism. This is an epistemological war between those who are committed to reality and those who want to impose a delusion, a vicious delusion on the rest of us.
Well, I know Nikos wants to get to Ben and Jerry's, but before that, I think Antoine has a comment on this.
Two things. I do agree that there's a question of epistemology there. And I think it's linked to how critical theory approaches many of its subjects, such as what are most commonly referred to like critical feminism. In the case of critical feminism, it's the same kind of logic where you were talking about Margaret Thatcher, who is not considered a woman anymore the second she acts like a man. And this fits exactly within the critical theory framework, which is identity is essentially what you are. It's about gender and identity. And if you identify yourself as a specific gender, if you act a certain way, then you are that gender. In other words, if you think you're a man and you want to act manly and you try to do so, then you're a man. And I think a very similar logic applies to what you were talking about certain Black people who have conservative views or libertarian views, individualist views, who are considered not Black. I think it's a very similar mindset in that essentially critical theory has conceptualized Blackness in the same way as critical feminism has conceptualized gender. And both are linked to essentially how you think. And for critical theory, how you think, essentially, if you think, according to them, like a woman, then you're a woman. And in the same way, for the critical theorists of race, if you think like what they think a Black person should think, then you're Black. And inversely, if you don't think like what they expect of you, then you are not that skin color. And obviously, this is mainly an epistemological problem, because the question is, how do you create those concepts and what can you do with them afterwards? Are they in use, right?
Yeah, you're right. It's part of, Antoine, you're right. It's part of the leftist, the Marxist left delusion. And, Ayn Rand called this primacy of consciousness. This is the primacy of consciousness approach, to metaphysics. So if I identify as a female, then I'm a female. And so consciousness supersedes biology, it supersedes nature, it supersedes reality, because in reality, I'm not a female, I'm a male. And reminds me of that Monty Python skit, talking about some male. Where would he have a baby? Where would he gestate a baby? In a box? Yeah, I can't have a baby. It takes a woman to do that, no matter how much I identify as a female, I'm a male. And if society, if all these leftist members of society conceive of Margaret Thatcher as a man, rationally, it's irrelevant. She's a woman. That point's not debatable. I mean, she's biologically female. So yeah, you see the primacy of consciousness mentality, and two of its not in its religious iteration, because these guys are secularists. In fact, the Marxists are philosophic materialists, right? Everything is matter. But you see it in the social and personal versions. If society claims Margaret Thatcher is a male, then she's a male regardless of biology. And at the personal level, if I identify as a woman, then I'm a woman regardless of biology, regardless of reality. This is very scary. This is very irrational. It's very scary. It could only lead to terrible violence, because we're rewriting reality. We're giving up our rational faculty, in favor of delusions. And when we give up our rational faculty, in addition to giving up our ability to understand nature's laws, and build and create and grow in nature, we're giving up our tool to adjudicate social disagreements. The reason is the only way we could peacefully adjudicate any disagreements that inevitably arise, whether interpersonal or international. Once we give that up for some vision that completely breaks with reality, there were a bunch of psychotics. These people are not much different than Islamic jihadists. The jihadists are delusional. I mean, they're living in this fantasy world, in this religious construct that they've created. They're not living in reality. And so are the Marxists. They're living in a delusional world, except it's a secular delusion rather than a supernatural delusion. But it's a delusion, and it's not only false, it's irrational, and it's supremely dangerous.
So let's make sure here that we understand what's happening. The mistake that many people on the right do, they perceive this as, this is an attack on white or on whiteness. This is an attack on standards, and this is what I mean. If you see some of the most radical critical race theorists, they will say things such as objectivity is white supremacy, reason is white supremacy. I've even found some saying something like arriving on time or expecting people to arrive on time is white supremacy. And in my book, on the upcoming book, on the chapter on racial thinking, I have 2 pages of weird kinds of examples. So things that have to do with what we call Western civilization, with what we call values of enlightenment. These are the things that they attack. So it's not that it's even bigger than this. Is they don't like one race or another. It goes to the core of what it means to be a rational human being. The second thing is, I don't want to psychologize, but I think there's many issues that have to do with self-esteem among the proponents of these movements. And you can see this with some of the workshops they organize, which is our workshop where you pay a lot of money and you go for 3 days to, quote, get rid of your white privilege. Or you see the protest these days, people kneeling down and say, I'm sorry for my white privilege. This is religious. This is the dirtiest trick in religion, is making you feel guilty for things that you haven't done. And this is what they're doing. You should have unearned guilt. And the last thing I want to say, I saw a poster, a meme with a person. It said something like, I cannot understand you, but I will respect you and I will step aside and I will let you speak. So it was supposedly a white person saying, look, I cannot understand your lived experience, but I'll step aside. If you cannot understand someone, how can you step aside and have faith? I mean, they basically say, I throw away my reason because we don't talk the same language. See the racist undertones here. We don't talk the same language, therefore I cannot understand you. And because I can't understand you, basically, I'll shut up. What must the self-esteem of a person be to say, I have no idea what's been happening here, but I'll shut up? So again, I don't want to make this personal and put on the psychological level, but there is something seriously wrong with this idea that A, I cannot talk the same language with you. So how can we have solidarity if we don't talk the same language?
And we can't communicate.
Yes, we can't communicate. This is an epistemological tower of Babel. Everyone talks a different language. But also, I will shut up because who am I to talk? Well, we're among mostly objectivists here, so you know what Ayn Rand says. The person who says, who am I to know, is the person who says, who am I to live? You basically throw away your number one tool of understanding the world and living and flourishing in the world.
I mean, you're absolutely right, Nikos. This is not fundamentally an attack on capitalism or on white people or on males or on white males. This is an attack on rationality. And they in a way, Nikos, and Antoine, not Razi, he's not white, but for us white men, they're very flattering. They conflate rationality with white males. Would that were true. That Hitler and guys like that would have been rational. But yeah, this is an attack on rationality. I mean, the idea that we need to, and we were discussing this with Dr. Frawley a few months ago. I forget her first name is
Ashley.
Ashley, yeah. We discussed it with her, and to her, and she's obviously very benign, version of a Marxist. But to her, we have, if I remember correctly, we have to work because, a capitalist society, requires of us. And I pointed out, as a good objectivist, we have to work because of nature. We don't live in a Garden of Eden. Nature requires us to be productive. Well, according to these virulent racists that that we're talking about, no, the idea that we have to be productive is simply a white male prejudice. It's simply it's simply an imposition that white people have mandated or try to impose on on the rest of us. Whereas the truth is, of course, nature. We don't live in a Garden of Eden. Nature doesn't just hand to us whatever it is we need to survive. This is part of reality, and so it's an attack on this kind of racism is an attack on our awareness of reality. It's an attack on our rationality. That's what makes it so dangerous. It's a fundamentally irrational phenomenon attacking rationality as such, and that's exactly what Hitler and the Nazis did. Right? Rationality was a Jewish tool, right? Logic was a Jewish tool, and this kind of overt rationality, overt irrationality, and rejection of rationality can only lead to terrible violence. Because,
by the way, notice also the Platonism here. There might be no racists, but racism is institutional. So there's this cloud above us, not related to any concrete human being, which is kind of following us wherever we go.
And dark cloud it is. It's 3:00, guys, in New York. I got to get going, but this has been a stimulating discussion, so I was glad I was able to contribute to it.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Andy. And if you have a few more seconds, then you can hear the first sentence that I'm gonna quote from the Ben and Jerry's statement from yesterday.
No, it's just I got books to write. It just gets me so angry. I gotta get out of here, guys.
All right, we'll see you soon.
Andy, thanks.
I'll see you guys soon.
And for the rest of you, here's the sentence. So this is the full thing is long, but I'm just gonna read this. What happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis is the fruit born of toxic seeds planted on the shores of our country in Jamestown in 1619, when the first enslaved men and women arrived on this continent. And then it goes on. But that's where, where they talk about America being institutionally racist, and that's a tremendous statement to me, because in 1619, you know, it's not like everywhere you went in the world there's, this racial diversity and people of different colors and races and creeds were, living and working together in harmony. And all of a sudden America came along and invented this thing called slavery, as by the way, I think many students think nowadays.
Oh, the majority, let me clarify this. The majority of the students think, at least in my experience, that slavery is this uniquely Western phenomenon. Sorry, second time I interrupted you. Go on.
Well, yeah, I actually wanted to get the discussion started on this, because I think that the fact that they go to America's history as if this is something that America brought to the world rather than took away, basically, because it's this idea of individualism and individual rights that was first, codified into the system of government in the U.S., even though clearly in a far from perfect manner, because it allowed for slavery. Uh, but it was these ideas came, or in large part were first implemented in America. The idea that we should judge people as individuals, yet America is blamed for racism itself.
First of all, notice how it's considered self-evident that this was a racist crime when we have zero evidence about that. Zero. I mean, it very well could be, but we haven't got a specific evidence about that. It's what Peikoff says, the possible and the probable, but I'm very interested where it stands in the Peikoff scale. Because I think in the Peikoff scale, it would be at the very, very beginning of the scale, because we haven't got a positive clue that there was a racist undertone to this police officer. Now, whatever the motive, this was a horrendous way, this was a crime. Kneeling on someone's neck for 9 minutes, it's a crime. But for these people to take advantage of all this outrage out there, to say with such certainty, A, that this was a racist crime, the fact that people rushed so quickly to say, to capitalize on this, because this is capitalization. This is saying, I'm gonna jump on this narrative and I'm gonna impose my agenda. But see what dirty thing they're doing here. They're literally throwing, what's the phrase? Throwing fuel to fire. Well, in Greece we say they throw oil to fire, which I never got what's the point, like what happened. But anyway, so they're throwing oil to the fire. And this is once the riots have begun. So this is not to say that if someone goes out and riots and says, I'm rioting because I saw Ben and Jerry, that resolves them of responsibility. But if you try to capitalize on this based on something which at the moment is non-existent, then you should be ashamed of yourself. You should really be ashamed of yourself, because you are like these kids in school that they would see a fight and they would go and poke people and say, fight even more. Like it's really infuriating. It's because it has very real consequences. All this stuff, all this hate has very real consequences. And it's very easy, of course, for Ben and Jerry to do this. And the other, sorry, one more thing. There are some journalists who said, oh, this athlete kind of took the difficult decision and took a stand. Or he didn't shy away from making a stand. Sorry, but making a stand these days in favor of this narrative is the easiest and most conformist thing that you can do. I'm not saying it's wrong. Okay, taking a stand is not wrong if you really want to bring change and to bring justice. But let's not kid ourselves that this is something which is, you're basically attacking a straw man, because there's no one there. There's no part of the establishment that is against your narrative. There's no part of the establishment that gave any justification to this horrible act by this police officer. So let's not kid ourselves that you are taking a stand. You're not. You're jumping the bandwagon.
Yeah, and it's comfortable for some athletes to take the stand. I mean, or take the knee, as what's his name, Colin Kaepernick was he made this famous, but he was taking a stand against what? I mean, he's black. He's an American. Is he oppressed? He makes millions of dollars a year. He lives, a life that the average person in any country in the world, including the U.S., would love to live, and he's able to do that in the U.S. of A. So, what is it? What is it that allows them to get away with it? Allows people like Colin Kaepernick to get away with it, allows Ben and Jerry's to put out a statement like this, and they're not going to get the response, for example, that I don't think they're going to get the type of reaction that Gillette got for their ad that was offensive to half the population. Um, why is this going to pass? And by the way, is it worse than the Gillette ad?
Oh, that's a very difficult question. But let me start from the end. Why they can get away with it? First of all, because unfortunately, the police is not blameless here. Now, people who live in a bubble on Twitter, there are two bubbles at the moment on Twitter. The one bubble says, I can only see lootings and lynchings and the protests and the rioters doing horrible things. But there's a second bubble who says, I only see police brutality. But the truth is we see both. I've seen countless of videos with police officers in almost cold blood doing things that should be unacceptable. Now, some of them have been prosecuted already. But the fact, for example, remember that video that someone grabbed someone who was just talking. Now, I can understand the police officer is under stress, but this was not one of these situations. So let's be very clear here. The police is also up to a big part to blame for what is happening, for the way they're dealing with some peaceful protesters. And again, I'm not talking about the heat of the moment where you get bricks and all that stuff. But what we see quite often is you are tough with peaceful people and you shy away from the people who are dangerous and are doing the dangerous stuff. So one reason they can get away with it is that the police and the reaction by the state, and by this I mean mostly by the president, has not been the one that it should be. That's one thing. That's not an excuse. That's one thing. Now, which is worse? Is it this or Gillette? I cannot specifically point the finger to Ben and Jerry's because they didn't do something very different from what everyone else does. We've seen sports clubs doing this, and the implication is that we take a stance against white supremacy. Ben and Jerry's managed to say it openly. So I don't think in the pantheon, and I don't think it will go down to the history books in the same way that the Gillette thing went down. But I think it's more, in a way, it's more to be criticized because they did it while there was this literally fire going on. And they went to capitalize on that. Just to cut them some slack, and not cut them some slack, but the way I picture this is that the person managing that account is probably a social sciences graduate. So they actually believe that. That's the only thing they've been taught. For them, it's like, yeah, obviously, it's this. I've said this in previous meetups. Quite often, my students, when they talk about the patriarchy or when they talk about white supremacy, although I've told them you always need to use source, except if something is a common truth. For example, the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. Then you don't need to use a source. Very often, when they talk about the patriarchy, or patriarchy, sorry, it's a Greek word, I always get confused how to pronounce it. When they talk about the patriarchy or the white supremacy, they don't use a source. Why? Because it's self-evident. So maybe I was a bit unfair when I was saying that this person was throwing fuel to fire, because there's a chance that this person didn't know any better, because that's the only worldview that person has been exposed. Now, that does not release that person from responsibility, but it makes it more understandable in terms of it wasn't like we're going to jump in the bandwagon to capitalize. So who knows which of the two things it is.
Yeah, and we've seen similar things from Ben and Jerry's. I don't know who it is. It's not one person running their Twitter account. It's a whole marketing sort of. This is where they stand, and they want to make it clear. So, but since Antoine, it may be from before that he has his hand up, but it is up and he's unmuted. So, Antoine, which is worse, the Gillette ad, or I don't know if you've read the full statement. You're not missing out much, but
I have neither read the statement nor seen the Gillette ad, so this question is not for me.
you've never seen the Gillette ad attacking men, the boys will be boys ad?
No, I couldn't be bothered.
Well, you should watch it.
My life is surprisingly like void of cancer right now, and I don't need to add some.
Well, you should add it. You should watch it, and then so that you'll know that you will never buy Gillette again. Because I think that was a very convincing ad to if that was the goal. For me, yeah, Nikos, what you mentioned about this potentially inciting violence.
Oh no, I didn't say it incites violence. I don't believe in inciting violence unless it's like a super extreme. I didn't say it incite. I'm just saying
it adds fuel. Yeah.
Yeah, but I didn't mean it in the inciting way. But yeah.
All right, then I'll say it. Yeah, it adds fuel to the fire. I think the violence will happen anyway. The people who want to be violent on such occasion are going to be violent if they see the opportunity. And this definitely does add fuel to the fire. On the other hand, the Gillette ad was, this was written, you know, recently and quickly, whereas the Gillette ad was something they had to work on for a long time. I don't know. They're both bad. Let's just agree that this kind of corporate behavior shouldn't be encouraged. I mean, we're not expecting companies to change the culture, but you also have to decide where you're going to be blindly following it into the abyss, if that is the case.
By the way, imagine, I'm just making this up, Shell or I don't know, British Airways or Microsoft coming up with a 3-minute ad on how we need to defend the values of the Enlightenment, or what we call Western civilization, or whatever we want to call it. It's completely unimaginable. I mean, even if we saw it in a satire, we wouldn't laugh because, like, okay, that's gone too far. It's not even conceivable.
No, but it wouldn't be allowed to air in the UK.
Probably that's a good point. It wouldn't be allowed to air. It would go down in YouTube immediately. But again, the fact that we live in this, quote, Eurocentric, white supremacy or whatever society, when someone standing up and saying, there is something to defend here, there is something good in our values, in our principles, in our history. Yes, there are dark moments, but also we are a moral country. We have a moral constitution. We fought a war against slavery, and yes, this was later than it should be, and this took way longer than it should be. But again, there are things to be proud of, but it's very unlikely that someone's going to stand up for these values. I mean, even after the fiasco with Gillette, there was all these very, very small, marginal companies on the internet. There was like a saving company that created an ad with a positive message for masculinity, and no one even remembers its name. So this should be the reply to this preposterous arguments that we live in countries that are institutionally racist or white supremacist or whatever. This goes so much against everything we see around us. It's a lie of such magnitude, which is probably why it goes unchallenged. It's like, where do you start attacking such a huge lie? And yet it's considered the norm.
Yeah, I remember one of the, I'll come to you in a minute or in a few seconds, but I remember one of the ads, I think it was a watch company, company that made watches, that had a positive ad about men after the...
Yeah, that was it. Sorry, it wasn't a saving. It was a watches company.
Yeah, and I also don't remember their name. And I do remember Gillette's name, but I remember Gillette's name as that company I will never, ever buy again from unless they, their CEO comes to me, to my flat personally, and apologizes to me, and then keeps going, until he gets to all men who live in the countries where this was aired. Antoine.
Yeah, I just wanted to try and present the argument for institutionalized racism without racists, which is obviously preposterous for epistemological reasons. but I think there's value in trying to see exactly where it comes from. At least from what I've heard, there is a logic behind how it's possible to have institutionalized racism without people actively being racist, like having a racist mindset, thinking that races are superior, inferior, have specific qualities. And generally the argument is historical, and the explanation is historical, and the whole argument is derived from the observation of inequalities in society. Essentially, people look at society, they see what there's an inequality between those races or those genders, or those, they say, well, therefore there must be something there. And the explanation for what causes these inequalities, because people cannot fathom the idea that inequality could exist, or actually could exist naturally. And they say, well, the problem is mainly history, and it's why you reach reparations in the case of racism. They say, well, historically, Black communities have been stolen from, have been persecuted, have had the rough end of the stick. If in the last, I mean, we were talking about the 50s, 60s, right? So it's not that far away, they say, right? It's 50 years ago. Those behaviors by genuinely racist people have consequences that actually last longer than their lifetime. And even when those racists die, and you have a new society with new ethics and a new, maybe very progressive view on race, if there isn't an active effort to reduce inequality, then those inequalities which have been created by racism endure and are thus inherent in the system. And similarly, when, so obviously this is kind of an economic explanation, but there are other explanations around the kind of, I don't know, political organizations and good hospitals being in better neighborhoods. Essentially, the point is these kinds of services have been tailored for a white population at a time where the white population was considered to be more valuable. And now that this population is not considered more valuable, and these people are perfectly nice and normal and not racist, these institutions are still there and contribute to the inequality. And consequently, even though nobody is actively trying to do anything bad, that this inequality is still being furthered by the institutions.
Can I ask though, which institutions are we talking about? For example, education is not one of these institutions. Probably the best thing that could have been done for the education of disadvantaged people, which is free schools, with the coupon system that not coupon. How did Friedman call it?
Vouchers.
The voucher system. Of course, the people who complain about structural racism, they were the #1 opponents of anything like that. So we have education, we have justice. We can discuss the issue of justice. But again, where are all these people in the battle to decriminalize drugs, which is one of the ways that police and the justice system is victimizing poor people? And where are most poor people? Most poor people are to be found in ethnic minorities. So where are they in the struggle for this, right? So that's why I'm not convinced with this, because I want someone to point to me, these are the institutions that perpetuate this racism. And you will find that usually it's statist institutions who perpetuate horrendous statist legislations that are basically victimizing everyone. And if you really care about the less privileged people, or however we want to name this phenomenon, you have to be with us on the barricades against these laws and these practices. But I don't see them anywhere. I see this half-hearted, well, yeah, maybe there is some data about weed, but let's not go too far and let's make sure we regulate it too much. So where is your fervor? Where is your fight to actually attack the reasons why the police has to knock so many times the door of poorer people, or why the police should have to go on their door? And we see, of course, that there are many incidents of police violence against people from all backgrounds, and they have one thing in common, which is they are poorer or they live in poorer neighborhoods. So let's make clear who the wrongdoer here is. It is the state. And it is not because the state is racist, it is because the state is statist. So it's not race versus race, it's the state versus us. And even more versus those who are less, who are more towards the poorer classes.
Yeah, I don't know. First of all, you said drug decriminalization. I think it's important to note the difference between that and legalization. Because
sorry, I mean legalization.
Because full legalization, decriminalization means, you know, you don't go to jail, you get a ticket and you have to pay a fine. But that still means that the production and distribution is in the hands of criminals. But there's another policy, and I was watching, Andy mentioned Larry Elder before, and I was watching an interview with him today, and he was talking about the statistics of single motherhood in the US. And if you look at the statistics, that's where, and I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, although he gave them very well in that interview, but it's the clearest correlation of all the different, you know, subsets of the population and statistics that you can have about different groups is if you grew up without a father, you are more likely to become a criminal. And this is a particular group, a particular problem among Black Americans. And it has become much worse in the years since the option of welfare came along, and the option of basically if you have a kid as a woman without a father present, then you will get subsidized by the government essentially throughout that child's you know, throughout his childhood, as long as it's your responsibility to raise him and feed him. So and single the number of babies, that's a statistic that I do remember. The percentage of babies born out of wedlock, Black babies born out of wedlock, I think it was in the 60s, was 25%. And then when Larry Elder did this interview a few years ago, it was 75%. So this is a government created problem as well, that it's politically incorrect to address it as well, because you know, besides the racial issue, you're also now you know, attacking something that is being praised generally in the culture, which is single motherhood. You know, because we should celebrate it, because they're doing it alone. They're being a mother and having a career in some cases at the same time, and this apparently is a good idea. So yeah, Nikos, I know you have a job in academia, so you probably can't really say what you think about this. Or
no, I'll say what I think.
You can't say what I think about this, but maybe you can say what you think.
So I wouldn't ever discourage someone to do whatever they want in life. So I don't claim that this idea that you can be a single mother and have a career, I don't think this is infeasible. And if someone wants it, they should do it irrespective of what I or you say. The problem begins when there's this structural factor, as you said, with the welfare state, which gives false or the wrong incentives. And I don't want to go full conservative and full Jordan Peterson here. I will say one example. I don't like the term incentives. I don't think it's an incentive. I think it takes away from you the agency to take life in your own hands. So Razi, you couldn't attend Monday's meetup, but I mentioned, I don't know if you've seen this scene with the MMA fighter Joe Jones, who went and took the sprays from some kids. So there's this very famous MMA fighter, and there's a video. He goes in the middle of the riot, and he walks around, and he basically takes away the vandalism instrument for kids. And he tells them something like, hey, kid, give me this. Now, I'm sure the kids have no idea who this guy is, but they see for a change someone who has who looks like he knows what he's doing, who seems like he's in charge. They see for a change someone with authority. And you see immediately, they respect the authority. And these are very young kids. Immediately, they don't even argue. And the guy doesn't have to tell them, do you know who I am? I can destroy you like that. I'm the best pound-to-pound MMA fighter in the world. They see a figure who knows what he's doing and who makes a stand, and immediately they say, yes, okay, take it. So I think there are some lessons there, okay? We had a long discussion on Monday whether there's an issue that with fatherhood, because I brought the examples of the Greek riots, in which case lack of fathers was not clearly the problem, but there is something there. There seems to be, at least if we want to be serious in terms of doing social research, that there is a very strong correlation between kids being born outside of the wedlock, however it's called, and these families not doing as well. And even if you take it from the simplest point of view, how much time you have with your kid, like even if you're a single father, this is not to blame single mother, even if you're a single father, how much money you can make, how much time you can give to your child, is going to be very diminished compared to something else. And again, this is a trend. Okay, I'm not saying that every single case this is the case, but this is a trend which is at least worth discussing. And as Razi said, this is a no-go zone. This should not be brought to attention.
Yeah, it's a no-go zone. And yeah, the question for me, the reason I question whether you can have, whether you can be a great parent and have a successful career at the same time is a question of time. You are limited in time. It's not, a woman can't do it. It's a person, I don't think, can do it. And maybe there are very rare cases, but I don't see why somebody would attempt it, by the way. If you want to be a great doctor and a great lawyer, you just can't do it at the same time. You have to pick one, and then maybe you can do it for a bit and then do the other. But by the way, with a child, you have to let the child grow up before you.
By the way, this is the very reason. So I don't want someone to say, oh, objectivists are elitists. Very famous figures in the objectivist movement, and everyone knows who I'm talking about, I think clearly said, the reason I didn't have a child is because I don't think I could focus so much on what was my highest priority, which was writing. Am I right, Raz? Didn't Rand mention this?
I don't remember what she said about it, but I mean, that is a consideration that people make. I mean, having a child should be a decision. It shouldn't be something that, everybody has a child, and I'm at that age, so now I have to have a child. All my friends are having children. If I don't have a child now, the child, I have it later, who's it going to play with, and all those sorts of considerations that aren't, the decision to have a child or not is a bigger decision of which career path to take, because the latter is reversible. So, and people don't actually make the decision to have children. And I think they should, if they want to, that they should make that decision.
Well, many people do, but anyway. Shall we go to the question in the chat?
Yeah, in a second, just a couple of things I want to mention. First of all, I also don't want to sound like a conservative or like Jordan Peterson, but you mentioned John Jones, and I have to say that he should definitely clean his room before he tells other people to put their house in order. Antoine,
I don't know what this refers to, but that was
a good. He had his issues throughout his career, and he lost his title because of those issues, right?
Well, if it's anyway, I don't know. I'll check it out, and maybe we'll discuss in the future. But.
All right. Antoine posted on the chat the Gillette counter ad by Edgard Watches. So Edgard Watches are not, as of now, sponsor of the I9 Center UK. Though if you want to sponsor us, call me. But we're going to advertise them anyway because they stuck it to Gillette. Well done. And Rob says in the chat, how do you think the activists managed to make this issue so global? My Instagram was just black squares for a whole day. Never seen anything like it. My guess would be the easy access to the video footage.
Well, in 2008, when the riots happened in Athens, there was a video, but it was basically just the sound. So it's not that seeing the video makes a difference, but I mean, the funniest spectacle on Instagram is people who change their profile pic today. So basically, they said, oh, they saw something happen. It's like, I'm going to do the same. I mean, it's clearly that it was Blackout Tuesday, but you saw people like, oh, I'm late in this bandwagon, I'll do it today. Now, I don't know what the reason is. First of all, again, many people truly believe that they can make a change with that. And I cannot judge this, right? If you truly believe that doing this is, and you can persuade me that this is going to do something significant, good for you. Remember, we live in times where the power of following the narrative is very important, because not doing so has consequences in the era of social media. I remember one thing. There's a single basketball player in EuroLeague, a single basketball player, American basketball player in EuroLeague, who said something sympathetic about Trump. That was years ago. And there were reporters tagging him in various occasions, tagging him on Twitter, saying, why don't you condemn Trump? How can you not condemn Trump? And yesterday I saw a lot of people tagging athletes saying, oh, you don't want to compromise your image. That's why you don't put the black square. And I can understand a lot of people are saying, look, my life is going as exactly as I wanted it to go. My dreams are coming a reality with my business. That's not the hill to die on, even if they don't truly believe in it. So it's like, look, I'm doing something good here, right? So I'm not going to make a big fuss about it. I'm doing something good. I will do it. So there's nothing wrong with it. The problem is when by doing this, you completely drop the context. So again, most people believe, following all these trends, that America is an institutionalist, racist society. False. That Trump somehow has something to do with police violence. False. Trump has zero or very little control on the police on a state level. Or they believe that this is happening because there's this huge injustice that this police officer, again, once more escaped with this. False. And even in previous events, for example, in the Ferguson riots, or in the case with Zimmerman, these cases where people thought there's a huge injustice here, if you see the legal procedures, it's very difficult to say that something truly unjust happened here, right? So with the standards of justice that we have, so put differently, by following uncritically all these trends, the trap is that you get a false image of what is happening out there. And this is why I got angry and I had this rant about the Ben & Jerry ad. Every person has their own responsibility to understand what the world out there is. But it's very difficult when you get this tsunami of messages. It's very easy to lose the big picture and to create a view that is not the real view. And again, you can say now it's for a good cause. In history, we've seen time and again group thinking leading to disasters. History will show whether the lockdown was one of these moments, but we've seen definitely worse moments. I mentioned in the past the horror in Rwanda and what group thinking had to do with this, because you had a lot of Hutus saying, well, I know that this Tutsi didn't do anything wrong, but he's a Tutsi. Now, I don't believe that a person can reach this stage if there hasn't been a process of months, if not years, of this bombarding with these messages. At the very end of the day, it's still his own moral culpability. But you have to be a moral hero quite often to see clear and to close your ears to this noise and make a clear judgment based on the facts of reality.
Yeah, and being outside the Overton window, where often we have and we will continue to express views that are that people find objectionable, and for anybody who sees any of our content and thinks, we're trying to be contrarian for the sake of it, that's not what's going on here. And I hope if this is the first video you've seen of the Ayn Rand Center UK, you'll see some more. As Nikos said, we're trying to look at the big picture, and we're trying to avoid falling into the trap of groupthink, which good people can fall into. So, and
That's the one thing about contrarian, Raji. I really hate it when I'm against them. Like, I really wish that everyone would agree with me. This idea that some people have, that that people, or they say it quite often for Spike, for example, that, oh, you get the kicks for being no, it sucks. You lose friends. You have people constantly giving you, considering that you have the wrong motives. It sucks being the lone voice against the majority. So not only it's non-contrarianism, I would be so happy if the majority of people would agree with me. Actually, that's, in a way, I would say that's a life goal, that I manage to persuade as many people as possible to what I strongly believe is true. So this idea that we are contrarians is not the case. And actually, a contrarian is a second-hander. A contrarian checks what other people think and does the opposite. I try to do the opposite. I try to think with my mind, and that's why for days I wouldn't tweet anything about all this that was happening, because I didn't have a clear picture yet. So anyway, enough of patting our own back.
Well, I'm going to do a little bit more of that and say, yeah, we hope to see the day where the majority agrees with you, and we are going to do whatever we can to make that day happen as soon as possible. And other than 3 events a week on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays for 2 hours, we're also going to have, starting this Friday, every weekday, a show on Facebook Live, which will feature Nikos as co-host on many of the shows. The first one will be co-hosted by Nikos and Gloria Alvarez, and they will discuss today's topic, but it'll be a 20-minute rapid-fire discussion. I hope you'll all watch it and let everybody know about it so that we can someday make Nikos Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you. You'll see Nikos on Friday, and we'll see you on Saturday with Josh.